Hey everybody. This is the first of our mini lectures that will hopefully give us sort of a jumping off point. The goal of this series is for me to discuss some of the information that was covered in the book and the readings, try to tie the theories that you're reading into some practice knowledge and some direct skills that you can apply in your work. But it's also an opportunity for you to think of questions that have come up during the week. If any of the things that I say aren't clear or something in the reading that you want to check in on, we'll have some time at the end of class going forward um, to do brief Q&As. So I have some notes to the side, so if you see my eyes darting back and forth, that's what it is. There's also a possibility that a chicken could come flying through the screen. There's a nice little gentleman next to me right now in a therapy swing, so I don't think he'll be jumping up on us, but you might hear his voice from time to time. So the first conversation I want to talk about, and it's really an important one, and it's when we lose group members, whether it's because they just vanish, whether they drop out of the group experience, whether they pass away, whether they vanish without any reason. It's a phenomenon that exists in a lot of groups, and it can sometimes be a really frustrating thing for the group leader. It's hard not to take those things personally when they're happening, but it can also disrupt the equilibrium that's existing within the group and really affect the norms and the overall arc of what's happening. As we discussed last week, group dynamics are incredibly important. They tell the underlying story, but they also form kind of almost a maladaptive balance for the group to exist in. And so if you've gotten some of that dynamic coming, and so all of a sudden maybe you lose your scapegoat because they've been tired of being scapegoated for so long, or your gatekeeper decides enough is enough and needs to move on, the group needs that role filled in some one way or another. Or it loses its equilibrium, the anxiety lifts up, and the group's ego strengths are then called into question. So really thinking about what creates the dropout, what creates that phenomenon, that was a chicken, is really, really important. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that were brought up in the article on cast outs and dropouts, and then hopefully we'll have a broader discussion in class on Tuesday. So a really great little definition that they gave in the beginning of it, and it was about group resistance. And the author said that it's any form of non-cooperative behavior which, if permitted to continue, would seriously disrupt the functioning of the group, family, or lead to the elimination of one of its members. So they're using this word or this phrase as resistance. And those of you who have studied solution-focused therapy, things like motivational interviewing, you'll remember that resistance was really more of an indication of the facilitator, of the therapist, more than what the individual was experiencing within the room. So in the group, when we're talking about group resistance, we can still frame it in a very similar way, so that we can kind of look at ourselves and the work that we've done in creating the norms, the culture, the structure of the group that has either led to some of these other phenomena that the article talks about, or have we created something that almost protects or insulates us from it. So they came up, there's been a lot of studies on group retention, and these are fairly common variables that they found. But the main reasons for dropouts are issues with intimacy, group deviance, subgrouping, which is a really, really big one, the presence of early provocateurs or the deviant members coming up too fast. But a big one is problem and orientation to group therapy. And we've discussed this in class several times about the real need to do assessment and how agencies just either aren't able to or don't know that they should be doing more in regards to really assessing the appropriateness. But that first one, the problems of intimacy, I want to spend a little bit of time on because the article mentions a couple aspects of it, but I want to talk a little bit more about what that looks like sometimes. So they mention that the problems in intimacy can include the schizoid withdrawal. And so those of you who have been studying some of the personality disorders, we want you to think of the schizoid in regards to the personality concept, not looking more at like schizotypal kind of diagnostic behavior that you would get into with more of the mental health diagnosis. We're talking a little bit more about the personality. And so that schizoid withdrawal is that sort of isolated feeling. This particular individual, probably not super appropriate for groups at that time because the personality structure of engaging with others produces a lot of anxiety, so they're going to have to find all sorts of different coping methods within the group, and that can lead to dynamics that can derail the process. So that schizoid withdrawal, just that individual who doesn't connect, who it takes them a lot longer to make deep and to make connections. So being able to recognize that, if you're able to do some pre-work, you can sometimes interview someone and you'll start to see some of those aspects of personality beginning to come out. So you can kind of assume, and you can try to adjust the way that you begin the bonding process, the cohesion process, so that you're aware that this individual might have some of those characteristics. There's the intense fear of exposure. This is so huge, especially with our populations, or incredibly vulnerable populations that have been used to being very targeted. There can be a lot of like healthy paranoia about saying things to groups of people, especially groups of people with like a professional in the room. So knowing where people come from can be really, really important as much as you can. Again, this comes back to the assessment process. But also trying to instill early on the concept of confidentiality and privacy. And those are two different things. And confidentiality has limits, right? Like, and it also allows access to specific information. But privacy is something more intimate. So exploring and unpacking the difference between those two, being able to say, there's limits to confidentiality in the group around child abuse, homicidal or suicidal behavior, whatever else might be connected. If you're in the VA, there's certain rules about confidentiality that don't exist outside of the VA, because they are your client tends to be the U.S. government as opposed to just the clients in the room. So they have different levels of confidentiality and different laws there. So you understanding what your agency, your group, and your clients' levels of confidentiality and exceptions are incredibly important. But privacy is the minutia. It's the details that they're going to be bringing to the group process that maybe no one has any right to know about, other than the folks that are in the group, right? A lot of times people feel like if I'm on a treatment team, everyone on the team deserves to know everything. And that's not always true. That people don't need to know the intimate details. They need to know enough to do their jobs, right? So privacy is a way that we can talk about our secrets, and knowing that they're not going to go any further. And so that's a real genuine fear. And it's one of the highest levels of violation, because you can't really hold a group of people to the same level of confidentiality that you're held as a professional. So they can leave group and they can talk about whoever they want. They can say everything that was said in group if they want to. So how do you create that culture and that norming that makes them not want to, right? So that comes with cohesion, that comes with building trust in there. And that's why I think it's important to identify, like, problems in intimacy is the number one that this particular study found was the number one cause. So they ranked them in order. And so problems of intimacy are the number one reasons that people don't come back. That's an important thing to hold on to. And that's why I say you can never take too much time creating the culture and creating the bonding. I mean, a lot of times we want to get right directly into the content, and we ignore some of the really important need for early process. This is the real process. You want to create the environment where people can say anything, right, and be who they are. So they mentioned that the schizoid aspect, intense fear of exposure, maladaptive self-disclosure. This is a big one for folks who have like schizophrenia, people who have borderline personality disorder diagnoses, bipolar disorder, things that can wear down our sort of reality testing, our stimulus barriers in service of the ego, where we get, they call it like the diarrhea of the mouth, or people come in and they over disclose. This works two ways. One, it can repel the other group members, because if I come in and I launch in the first day with real deep and intimate details about my life, everyone else might feel like they have to do the same, right? Or I come in and they're like, this is going to be too much. This person's exploding in front of us. And if this is what group's about, I don't want to do it. So a lot of times folks early on, if there's a lot of self-disclosure and a lot of intimate details coming out, it can actually create a feeling of insecurity around being a member of the group and what's expected of me, right? Unrealistic demands for instant intimacy. That's a huge one, right? And it's one that we push for a little bit too fast usually as group leaders, because we want to get into it, right? We want it to be deep. And creating purpose and structure and norms and reinforcing those things and playing games to get to know each other. It's not juicy. It's not the deep, dark, cathartic stuff. And I think a lot of times we selfishly want to get to what we feel is the therapy of it without doing the real work that creates the environment where the therapy happens on its own. And so we want to be really careful about requesting that immediate intimacy. And I think that our group is starting to go through that process in class right now, where we've done some of the fun stuff, we've done some of the engaging stuff, we found things that we have in common. And now it's like, all right, now there's starting to become these requests for intimacy. So it'll be interesting to see how our group leaders navigate that, because it wasn't requested by everyone. But so are they hearing it as an unspoken desire from the group, or are they going to interpret it as something to guard against immediate intimacy too fast? So more will be revealed, I'm sure. So what's interesting too in this article is that I like it because it holds the mirror up to us. And it talks about our reaction to those early dropouts, right? So I talked a little bit more intensely about the problems of intimacy, but there's group deviancy that can propel people out. Sometimes the deviancy gets them kicked out because of the rules of the agency. This happens a lot in substance use treatment, where if somebody uses, they're kicked out. If people start dating, they're kicked out. But the intergroup deviancy might be more like people talking over each other, people getting aggressive, throwing things, yelling, screaming, all of that type of behavior. And they found, at least in this study, that sometimes getting rid of people, kicking people out of the group, or re-referring them, which is a nicer term, sometimes goes a long way to show the rest of the group that you're there to protect them. So the group deviancy, it's kind of a tough line to walk. But it comes down to this sort of fundamental idea that groups aren't designed for the wonderful cathartic experience of one person. They are designed for the overall healing of the overall group. And so sometimes with group deviancy, we have to make some of those hard calls that maybe this person isn't ready. And you don't want that one person to kind of hijack the whole group. Hopefully you're in an agency or in a position where you can help that person maybe dial it back to a smaller group, or just individual therapy or something that can get them ready. Because some people have kind of an immature emotional style that might not fit with the group and the topic and the process and the participants that are already there. So it's hard to see this, and sometimes we have to make some of those tough calls. One of the other reasons that folks drop out is the subgrouping. That's the clicky stuff. And you want to watch for that. And when you see it, you want to build on the intimacy that they brought in. A lot of times we get a little punitive, or we try to break it up. I've been in case conferences where people have been like, oh, they're becoming too close of friends. I'm not going to let them in this group anymore. We're worried about a relationship, so we're going to break them up. What I've found much more interesting is putting it in the room and saying, you two, I've noticed a really strong connection that's formed with you while the group has been going on. And I just wonder, what's allowed that to happen? Maybe we can share it with the group so that all of us can benefit from it, and it can help us increase our levels of cohesion. That does kind of two things. One, it puts the phenomenon in the room for all of us to sort of see. It normalizes and it validates the experience that those two individuals or those 3 or 4 individuals are having within the subgroup. And then it's strengths-based. It's saying that, this subgroup, you're doing something really powerful and important. Can you teach us, right? Can you teach us to be more intimate and more connected? And sometimes that decreases the anxiety in the room. And a lot of times the folks who aren't invited into the subgroup might be the scapegoat. They might be the monopolizer. They might just be the silent one. They might have that schizoid withdrawal sort of traits. But having the discussion about that is actually having a discussion about building intimacy, which is so important. So they use this wonderful word in the article for the next reason: the presence of early provocateurs. And this is an interesting group dynamic or group identity. And these are the folks that really come in out the gate, asking questions, pushing buttons. They're usually seeking boundaries. They're usually seeking the limits to behavior. They're looking to us or to the group as a whole to help them know where and what is acceptable. But oftentimes they come in so hot and so intense that they push other people out of the room. People are afraid of being in an environment where everybody's just, where people are coming in and just, firing off all of this behavior at the group as a whole. It makes them feel like they can't trust the safety and the security of the room itself. So that's another place where, as I talk about it, I think it probably instantly comes to your mind that this is something that, again, you can manage through norming, manage through culture formation, and manage through intensive cohesion. And also putting it in the room is really good. Being able to say, wow, you're really on fire today. I wonder if we could just back this up a second and talk about, what's really pushing you to disclose so much in this moment. Or, when you just said that, I got like super tense and anxious because you're talking so fast and you're saying so many aggressive things. I just wonder if anyone else had that sort of anxious, fearful moment when you started doing that. Because it's quite possible that if that's how that person enters into the group, that might also be how that person enters into other areas in their life, and they're just unaware that that's their comfort building behavior. That's really usually what that deviant behavior in the beginning was really about. It's about folks trying to find their comfort. And if you think about it through like an ego strength and ego defense lens, you can sort of see how a lot of this behavior fits into an ego strength, ego deficiency model. So ego psychology, I think, is an interesting philosophy and theory to sort of bring in when you're assessing group members, when you're looking at the group as a whole, because the group itself can have an ego identity. It can have an ego strength. It can have a set of ego defenses. Sometimes those dynamics that we talked about, when they're happening on the unconscious level and they're communicating group need, they're really filling the role of ego defenses for the group, right? It's defense of the group's ego, right? And so those can be hard to detect. That's why you kind of, as a group leader, you really have to be looking at these things through theoretical lenses so you can see what makes sense and what the group needs. Like, do I just need to help the group enhance its ego strategy, right? So, and then, the last one that they list here was problems in orientation to the group therapy. And a lot of times it's because as leaders, we don't feel like what we know we're orienting them to. We don't really fully understand the purpose. We don't have full buy-in in why we're running the group. We don't understand our role. Early on, we don't even feel like we have total skill yet. So all of those go into reasons why we avoid assessment, because we don't really know how exactly to assess the person. You're never going to get it right. Someone's going to present really wonderfully in a one-on-one interview, or they'll be endorsed really well by their counselor because they're doing great one-on-one work. All of those types of assessments are done in individual diets, right? They're not done in a group diet where all of those relational anxieties and fears and stressors can pop back up into the person's life. So we do what we can. I really urge you to try to find some way of evaluating appropriateness for groups. What helps is to understand what your purpose is, because then you can sort of say, is this person at a capacity where this purpose makes sense to them? Knowing what you're going to be doing down the road, like having a sort of a manual or a map at least of topics that you want to address, making sure that they're relevant, making sure that they fit your population, and then making sure that that people, that what level people sort of need to be at, and level of functioning, level of cognitive skill, in order to really take advantage of what it is that you're doing. So what was interesting when they looked at this is our reaction as therapists. So what they found was that in the study here, they talked about all of the therapists that were interviewed were angry or hated or disliked the dropouts. And so for me, that's great, because that's like, yay, it's countertransference. It's stuff we can work on. And there's a lot of reasons why we don't like the dropout, because we might feel like they have damaged something we spent time to create. We may take it personally. They might bring up literal transference from our own past and bring up abandonment themes that we've experienced within our own lives. If we ourselves have ever been members of group therapy and really love it, it can be taken as a deep level of insult. So we want to keep an eye on ourselves through this whole process. If somebody does drop out, really check in with yourself, use your support systems. Make sure that you're not bringing that transference back into the room, because what ends up happening the next time is that the group usually will ask you to join them in their reaction to the missing member. And if you're angry that the person dropped out, you might join them in behavior that makes them feel like, wow, if I'm not good, he'll hate me too, or she'll hate me, or they'll hate me too, right? So being able to deal with our stuff allows us to help facilitate a more authentic process for the group members as a whole. So the other thing that sometimes happens, and this is an interesting transferential dynamic. I love it. It's very object relations based, but what can sometimes happen is that you'll have the dropout, and then the group will take all of the things that they feel about you, the facilitator, and tell you the narrative of their hatred for you through the dropout. So if somebody's been kicked out, they'll come back in and they'll be like, well, I hated them because they were too rigid and they were always doing it. And so if you listen with that sort of second ear to the, because usually when folks choose to tell a story like that in a group, they're talking about the group. Sometimes they're talking very specifically about dynamics outside in the world or events that have happened, but listen deeper to see, does this story, does this narrative, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the next video clip where I'm going to talk about narrative therapy, but the question is, does this narrative that this person is telling me right now serve two purposes? Does it tell the actual literal story happening out in the world, but does it also tell sort of a mythical or metaphorical story of what's happening within the group itself? So really listening to those things and watching for that displacement, because it happens an awful lot. And so you want to listen in those moments to things that you've done and be like, wow, you know what, that some of that sounds like me. I'm wondering if anybody's having sort of a reaction towards me in the same way that they're having towards the cast out. Or I wonder if folks are blaming me for not creating a good enough structure in here that we could do the work, and now we've lost a member. So being humble enough to put that in the room allows the group to turn what could turn into role conflict, which I mentioned last week as the thing that destroys the group. Role conflict is like, I hate you and I hate the group because I hate you. Versus like system conflict, which is like, Steve hasn't done a good enough job making us feel safe, or we don't like the bathroom policy, or any of those things. Those are great conversations because it usually means we're going to leave with a better group after we have this conversation. So if you can take that displaced transference that's happening in the moment, own it, put it back in the room. Now all of a sudden we're talking about the group again, and we're not just talking about Steve. We're talking about reforming the norms, right? So that's an important part. The other piece here is just to acknowledge that the beginning of any group or any therapy experience, but we're in groups class, so we'll focus it on that. The beginning is the hardest part because that's when we're the most vulnerable. It's when we don't know enough about what we're getting into to really feel safe and comfortable. In my private practice, I always figure, some clients are going to have to reschedule that first session 3 or 4 times. And then once it starts, there's going to be some misses. There's going to be some late arrivals, partially because it's hard to incorporate something into your life. And the bigger one is like, who the heck am I? Like, they don't know me. I always take that as an indication of like taking a moment and really saying like, how am I communicating, who I am and what I believe about the work we're doing to them in a way that makes them feel engaged, and it usually happens. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes they never come back. But remembering that in the early part, and you can even say this to group members, like a lot of times we lose group members in the beginning because it's a very vulnerable time. We all don't know each other. We don't know each other's stories. We don't know anything about each other. And that can be kind of scary, So, and then telling them. So the first part of all of this is just us getting to know each other and seeing if we can build that cohesion. So some of the things that they found that folks are afraid of, they've done this through qualitative, a lot of qualitative research has come up with this stuff. But the idea that they have to share their time and attention with strangers, that's a huge one, right? Ordinarily, we don't choose to do that, right? We don't choose to just like go and join a new entire group of friends who are completely strange to us. We don't know anything about their backgrounds, and we're going to go there to share the most intimate details of our life. We just don't usually do that as humans, right? Being subject to their scrutiny. They're going to be judged, right? You could be in this group, and what you did to get there could be so socially acceptable that no one's going to want to talk to you. And those fears can be in there. So how do we neutralize those, validate the experience, normalize the experience, but then also create a sense of universality for folks like that? The other piece is, one of the biggest fears anyone I think our country has is like public speaking. And that's what you're asking folks to do in group. And not everybody likes talking in front of groups of people. I notice this in classes a lot, that I read the papers, and the words, the ideas, the critiques are just brilliant. And I'm like, oh my God, I wish this person talked more in class. But at the same time, not everybody likes to share in public. Some people are a little bit more private with those feelings. But now all of a sudden, either you're forced into a group or you're desperate enough to try one. And there's this feeling like, I'm going to have to do this thing that I absolutely hate doing. The other piece to this is that what I share could be upsetting to me. It could be unsettling. It could also be problematic for other people. A lot of times, folks with real deep depression are afraid that if they share their pain, they'll hurt someone else. And so I think in some of these situations, it's fear of what they'll do with the information I share, but also fear of what the information I share might do to them. Right. So that's a big one. And then having to negotiate issues of confidentiality, privacy, trust, and boundaries. So the more of that work that you do for them, the easier all those other things on the list tend to get. So that's really, when we spend a lot of time talking about structure and purpose and norms, I think we added an extra class on it just because I really wanted to hammer it home. That's why it's so important. It prevents people from leaving early if we do it just right. So one of the things that they brought up, which, it's like a no-brainer, but it's important because it was researched, right? And it's just this quote. He said, groups which have as their norms hostile, confrontational behavior, and sustained levels of anger, coercion, and constant feedback rarely achieve the desired level of cohesion. That's important because in some places, those are built into the systems we work in, right? I'm thinking of substance use. I always talk about those because groups are the basis of substance abuse treatment, but also in eating disorder clinics, any groups usually that work with perpetrators of violence or abuse tend to be very confrontational, very aggressive, because so much of the transference is coming in. And clients tend to be very ashamed of the behavior and fearful of what others will think about what they've done. So the defenses come up, and all of the things we've discussed in the entire other part of this little lecture all come home to roost in that exact moment. Oh, sorry, come home to roost, not the coolest thing to say with chickens. Well, it's not that bad. They do it anyway. So this next part, an establishing cooperative individual treatment relationship provides a solid home base for a venture into a group. So just kind of think about that. If we can, in our agencies, refer folks from individual work into the group dynamic, they have the anchor in us, right? Especially if it is us, or if it's not us, if you're working with a client and they're like, I really want to go into this CBT for depression group, but I'm really nervous. You can go through the list of things that we just talked about, and they're all on that in that article, and just ask, well, is this one of the things you're concerned about? Is this one of the things that you're concerned about? Then you can process it in the individual level, and then help them sort of brainstorm ways that they can sit with those things or deal with those things or cope with those things once they're in the actual group. That's another part of the assessment process. I like this article because I actually use this in the assessment process for groups. I'll say, it can be really hard to come in and feel like you're pressured to talk. And I just wonder if there's any fear around being in this group, feeling that you might be pushed to talk about things too fast. If you ever feel that way, how can you communicate that to me? All of those different things. If you can do it early on. If not, this is a great, first or second group. First group's great. Being able to say, how many of you have been in group therapy before? Okay, so how many of you have been in groups where people stopped showing up and dropped out? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about why folks do that and how maybe we can keep from doing that in our group. You can make that part of the group conversation as a whole. But utilizing, and if you are in an agency where people run groups and also see folks individually, and you know that one of your clients is going to a new group, um, having a conversation with that group leader can be really important. Talking to that client about what you know of that group and what you know of the strengths of that particular group leader can go a long way to making them feel like they're not by themselves, like you're going into the group with them as well. The next piece that I think is really important to talk about is, and we talked a little bit about in the beginning of this little lecture, which I think is becoming longer than I thought it was going to be, but and that's the transference experience. Transference in groups is like super interesting because you don't just have the transference between member and facilitator, but you have the transference between member and facilitator, member and member, member and member, member and member, member and member. And then you have the transference from member back to original member, member back to original member, back, and counter transference from us to them and from us to every other member. Right. So the transference meter is just like off the charts when it comes to group dynamics. And that's one of the things that kind of makes it challenging because feelings of abandonment can come up. If you over identify with one group member, other group members will feel under identified, and that will start to create a rift. That will start to create an internal narrative of being excluded that might result in acting out behavior to try to get your attention, to try to get you to come over towards them. We talked a lot about in dynamics, we talked about member to member transference and like the scapegoating or the monopolizers or the internal group leaders. But when we're talking about the relationship between us and them, it's harder to manage. And that's why the larger your group gets, the more difficult it is to sustain the therapeutic results. And a big part of that is because the transference just gets too unmanageable. If I have 6 or 7 people, I can sort of see and feel the transference as it's evolving. Once I hit 10, that usually is where the results start to dip a little bit. And a lot of it becomes, it's just so hard to manage all of that transference that's in the room. So I just want to make sure that I got all my notes on that, Mark. Oh, yeah. And of course, transference is harder to manage the more stimulus is happening within a group. So depending on a person's ego strength and how they react to being overstimulated, you'll see that in behavior, but recognize that it might have a root in some level of transference. So again, how you deal with transference. One, you want to clean yourself out. You want to know how you're responding, what you're feeling like towards these group members. If you start to notice the transferential experience between you and a client, you want to talk to someone about that quickly. You want, if you're in with your supervisor and you're like, yeah, I love this one group member, don't stop there. Like really dig into like, well, what is it about that group member that connects so deeply to you? And what is keeping you from connecting in that same way to the other members? Because as wonderful as it can sound, that I've got this great cohesion and this great connection with somebody, it can be a deeper level of transference that could end up making other people feel alienated. So you want to dig into that, figure out if it's your stuff. And once you sort of process through what's yours versus what's the group's, you might want to put some of it in there. Yalam, who's sort of the guru of all of groups, he's just one of the greatest thinkers and writers on group therapy and dynamic, is very brave, and he'll put his transference right in the room and just let it rip and see where it goes. Not everyone's that comfortable, but you can find graceful ways, especially as you get to know the group more. You don't want to rush to throw transference in the room. That's a sure way to get everybody to want to leave, because then they think you're just analyzing them the entire time, and that's not helpful. But you can start to bring it in as it develops, and when you really feel like it's like you've dealt with your part of the transference, you can then sort of bring it into the group to explore. So the next little piece, and it's related to transference, and it's how the group gets rid of members, right? So how do we cast groups out? One of the ways, and these are really interesting to see when they happen. And the first one is sort of uh, it's sort of like what happens when you meet someone new and you start asking them, oh, where'd you go to high school? Oh, did you know this person? Oh, have you ever been to this place? Oh, I went to a concert at that place. And they overload you with like questions and information and attempt to join. This happens in groups a lot, and it's interesting to watch how it happens in regards to gender, how it perceived gender, how it um, happens in regards to race. Like I can remember in substance use, there just weren't a lot of women. There were never as many women as men. But if we had two new clients starting a group, and one was a woman and one was a man, the woman would get peppered with 1,000 questions and never want to come back. And the man might be asked no questions and feel completely isolated and not want to come back. So how the group brings a person in, and how they treat them immediately goes a long way to telling you how the group feels about new members. And those new members are your responsibility as a group facilitator. To me, it's always helpful to get the group involved early. After you've established the group, you've got a core set of members, being able to say, we are eventually going to have new folks come in. How do we want to welcome them? What would have helped you on your first day? Let's brainstorm some ideas. What type of groups do we want to run on other people's first days? So that can be helpful. Yeah, the second one that they talk about is meeting the group member with conflict and tension-ridden session. So there's a new person in the room. This is the day I'm going to fight with Joe about stealing my cupcake 6 weeks ago, right? So the new person, it's almost like it's baptism by fire. Here you go. You want to be part of this group? This is what we talk about. Angry at cupcakes, right? And whatever that is. So you want to pay attention to that and just bring it back and say, we have a new member here, and it's interesting that you're bringing up like historical anger on the day that a brand new person is here. And I wonder if maybe you're feeling a little strange about a stranger being here. Maybe the stranger, depending on where you're at with the group and what you know about the stranger, sometimes it's helpful to bring that in. But it's also great data because it's telling you how the group, again, feels about a newcomer. But if you've established ritual, and ritual is a part of the group dynamic that everyone's agreed on, this tends to happen less and less often. This is another one that they talk about. So then you get the folks who are going to bash the group. And it might not be because they don't like the group. It might be because they don't want anyone new in the group. So they're going to tell them how awful it is. And usually this happens in pre-group, where they'll be like, oh my God, this is just the worst. It's an 8 a.m. class. It lasts like 6.5 hours. We have to run our own group, which is going nowhere, by the way. And then at the end, he like tucks in these ridiculous Q&A questions, right? So before the person even comes in, it's like, if I were you, I would just go take that other professor's groups class at like 6 at night. And it might be because the person really likes the group and doesn't want one more person brought in, or it could be because they really are just like unhappy, which is good for you to find out. So you can kind of look at what's going on there. But a lot of times it's a strategy to preserve the intimacy of the group. And this happens a lot with the folks who had trouble with intimacy in the beginning, because now it's like, all right, I just got to a point where I can say anything. And now you're bringing in someone that I don't know. And how am I going to say anything to them? All right. So understanding again that this is behavior that's not necessarily what it looks like. Right. So you want to go for the deeper meaning, but usually these things are an indicator that you need to readdress norm, structure, purpose, role. Okay. What else do they do? This one here. So they'll exclude the person from the conversation. All of a sudden, this is where all the inside jokes come out. The subgrouping becomes larger. They'll talk about, oh, do you remember when this person was in the group? Wasn't it so much better then? Or, these are the things we've talked about. This is what's so great about this group, which can create actually a feeling of exclusion. So again, the ritual and the normsing is really important in that. Some of the other things that you don't have as much control over are the extra group socializations, and sometimes sexual acting out or relationships that form between members outside of the group. And this is a tricky one because when navigated correctly, this is beautiful and amazing. But when not, it can really cause a lot of intergroup transference, especially if they're romantic relationships, just because that just tends to trigger people in a different way. Most agencies are terrified of those moments. Some of it's, legal. They're afraid of what will happen if something bad happens between the two of them, how it's going to affect the agency. But on a group level, we have those same fears. Even if just two members become best friends. I had a group where two members who were really socially isolated bonded, and they started having this really amazing relationship, and then they had a falling out, and both of their treatment just tanked. And I wasn't working individually with the two of them, so I didn't have a lot of control over processing that aspect. But when I look back, I wish that I'd put more of it in the room, because they had formed a subgroup that was so wonderful because of how isolated they were. And the reality was, I don't know that either one of them had the ego strength to adapt a larger network than just that one other person. But that two-person dyad didn't have enough ego strength to support a rupture. And so when they had a rupture in their friendship, they both went in opposite directions. So you want to watch for these things. You want to work with them. You want to be able to work with individuals, or at least their therapists, when you start to see some of this stuff come up, so that they can work on it individually, and then maybe come back a little strengthened with more coping skills as a result of the individual work that they did. So then the loss of members, that's just such a significant moment in the life of any group. Whether the person quits, whether the person dies, that's always incredibly hard, because there's a limit to what you're allowed to tell people. And it can really shoot off everything that we're trying to do. What sometimes happens is that the people drop out or leave in waves. That's the best indicator that you've created a sort of a toxic environment for the group. Sometimes it has nothing to do with you. Sometimes people get kicked out. I remember we had a shelter near Bellevue that closed down, and we lost like 12 people immediately, because there was no way they were going to take a 2-hour commute, no matter how productive the group was. So sometimes it's external factors, but in your own debrief and your post-mortem on your groups, you really want to look at, like, well, how did the culture and how did the structure contribute to people feeling driven away in some way. You want to really look at those things as you're going through it. So they talk a little bit about assessment. It was interesting. They talked about assessment as a problem, but we didn't get a whole lot of solutions. But the readiness for participation in the more stressful groups, the goal is to help people get to a place where they feel like they can say anything. That said, try to think of any place where you feel that way, where you can just go and say anything. Hopefully you have some people that you feel like you can go and say anything to, but most often we don't, right? But that's sort of the lofty goal, to create an atmosphere where people are comfortable really disclosing in an authentic way who they are. And so you want to look at people's doubts, uncertainties, fears, suspicions of motives, whether or not you really want to, when you're figuring out whether or not they're appropriate for the group. You want to think about cognitive function. You want to think about ego strengths. You want to think about their ability to relate. If you work in a community setting, being able to sort of assess them at lunch, or when they're interacting with others. Talk to their counselors about their relational history. As I go through that list, I'm sure you're like, oh, that's why people don't do assessments for groups. That's a lot of work. And if you have like 10 or 15 people that are coming to your group, it's even more work. But it's such important work. And then also, like, being able to, if you're not able to do that, saying to the group, not everyone's always appropriate for group. And if it gets to a point where I feel like maybe a different type of group or individual therapy might be more important, I'll just speak with you after, and we'll have that conversation and figure out what you feel is best moving forward. Because the initial part of that is the assessment, making sure that people are really ready. So you want to incorporate it early on, to tell people that this is something that might happen. You might need to go somewhere else. The other part of this that I really loved is just remember that at any given point, at any given day, one or more or all of the members of your group are thinking about leaving group. I'm sure that this happens in classes during tough days where people are like, this is not worth it. I'm just going to get up. I'm going to walk. I'm going to keep walking. I'm going to get on a bus. and I'm just going to build a new life somewhere because it gets so stressful. But our members are having those feelings too. It could be dimensional. It could just be a bad day that they're having, and it's like, this group is just too much. I've already had this huge commute. I got harassed on my way over here by a police officer. I didn't have my Metro card. I forgot my phone. I missed an appointment. And now I got to come in here and listen to Joe argue with somebody else about a cupcake that they stole 2 years ago. Right? So it's not remembering that it's not always driven by what's happening in the group, that external conflict within a person's life might make it really difficult for them to engage on that day. So again, don't take it too personally if on that particular day somebody wants to get the heck out of group. You'll hear statements like, oh, there's this class I want to take, or there's this experience I want to go to, or I'm really worried about my parents, which all can be true. They can all be true. But usually they existed before the group started. But you're just listening for the content of people saying that they may want to leave, or they may want to move on, or something like that. And then you want to explore it. You want to make sure, like, would you stay if group was different? Is there any particular part of group that you would improve? If you're going to be leaving today, could you give us some feedback about your experience, and so that maybe it'll help us moving forward? And if they bring up content that you're like, wow, we could actually change that. If we change that as a group, would you want to stay? Different things like that. So you want to make it, again, a place where people can say anything, even I want to leave group. And then the very last piece that I want to talk about here is termination. So group termination, sometimes it happens unplanned, and that's what we've been talking about the last 40 minutes or whatever. And that's your dropouts and your castouts. But when the termination is planned, this happens a lot in CBT groups, 10 to 15 sessions or whatever it might be. Happens a lot with parents. Parenting groups usually have end dates on them. Happens a lot with young kids because it usually follows the school schedule, things like that. So you want to be working on termination. A lot of times you're going to see people leave early because they don't know how to, or they don't want to deal with those issues of termination because they're too painful. So having that all in mind and starting termination conversations early, making sure that people, every group, it's if you're doing CBT at the end of the group, saying, just a reminder, we have 10 sessions left. So we do want to be thinking about what life after this is going to look like. When you're doing more intensive groups, it's also important to sort of be like, we're going to be saying goodbye to each other in 10 more groups. And so I was wondering if we could take some time next week to talk about what we might want to do at the end of that. Like, what would be a good saying goodbye moment for a group like this? Creating legacy. Do we want to, create a quilt, create a yarn, create a story? Do we want to write something for the next group that's going to come and inhabit this space? All of those things, the earlier we deal with termination, the more beautiful the termination process can be for us and for our group members. But do expect, if you haven't created the culture and you haven't really addressed termination, when it starts to get close, you're going to see people just drop out and leave. And that's a real missed opportunity because personally, I think termination is one of the most important parts of any therapeutic relationship. And the earlier we talk about it, even though it's uncomfortable, the earlier we talk about it, the better it tends to go. All right, so I think that gives us a good jumping off point. So on Tuesday, hopefully you will have had a chance to see this. Hopefully I will have figured out how to turn it into something I can actually upload. Cross your fingers. But so bring some Q&A, bring some questions. If you have some lived experience through groups you've either been a part of or groups that you've led or seen led, that would be helpful too. And we'll try to leave about 20 minutes at the end of class for a more in-depth discussion on this topic. All right. I hope this was helpful. If not, let me know, because I could have done other things with my Saturday night. I'm just kidding. All right. Have a great rest of the weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday.